Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hywel from JALT University, and I'll be presenting on student recommendations for online EL, or extensive listening, this afternoon. What is extensive listening? It's a method of getting listening practice that's described by Brown as an outgrowth of extensive reading. Renandia and Jacobs have argued that ER is well researched with well-documented benefits. Examples of these benefits are shown here on the slide. Vocabulary, grammar, reading fluency, and other positive affective gains. But they argue that EL has been comparatively little researched. EL definitions therefore require an understanding of the definitions of extensive reading. Extensive reading has various definitions, but three common points are firstly that a large amount of reading is required, certainly relative to comprehension questions used with passages in many language classrooms for reading instruction. Secondly, that the focus is on meaning and general understanding, which might be contrasted with looking for specific information to answer a question or complete some task. And thirdly, a relatively fast reading rate. So to achieve all of these three, the reading material should be at a relatively easy level for the student with little unknown vocabulary. Additionally, Day and Bamford include among their renowned principles for ER that students should choose their own reading material. Not all ER approaches always adhere to this, but it is relevant to the design of the EL intervention that I will describe. So then, how does this apply to what we mean by extensive listening? We already noted the description by Brown as an outgrowth of ER. So the three main points could be to listen fluently, get a large amount of listening, and focus on overall meaning. Waring, in answer to what is EL, states it involves fluently listening to a lot of comprehensible language. He advocates for students understanding 90% of content or information and 95 to 98% of grammar and vocabulary. So, does it work? Renandia and Farrell argue that it's a much more effective use of learners' time than explicitly teaching listening strategies in class. They argue that many teachers lack the specific expertise in listening strategies required to teach them effectively, that evidence does not clearly support its effectiveness, and that it takes up class time for students to learn about strategies that is not used specifically for listening practice. Although Siegel defends strategy use, even in disagreeing with Renandia and Farrell on this point, he acknowledges that the value of EL for listening practice cannot be overstated. Chang and Millett find that groups doing EL and doing EL while reading both make greater gains on listening fluency practice post-tests than a control group whose listening classes use other listening materials. For the present study, I used a narrow listening intervention. Narrow listening has been described as related to the idea of extensive listening and as one of the different activities that can be classified as EL. The main distinction to be drawn between narrow listening and EL is that in addition to the points that I've already mentioned, the listening material is narrowed by some other feature, such as listening materials all drawn from a particular genre, topic, or author. The present research was conducted with students in the relatively new Global Communication faculty at JALT University, a department in its fourth year of existence at the time of this study, now fifth. Although the students are communications majors rather than English majors, the program is an all-English program, so the participants are perhaps more analogous to English than non-English majors in the importance that the target language holds for them within their wider study program. The context is a listening class I teach to first-year students in the second quarter of the academic year. Unlike the typical university 15 by 90 minute weekly lesson schedule, in this quarter system the students are taught for 23 by 60 minutes, meeting 3 times a week for just under 8 weeks. This is one of 3 first-year English program classes that they have in this quarter, so they are receiving 9 60-minute English classes a week in FEP, plus a basic pronunciation training class, which is on the 15 by 90 minute basis as a semester class, and a new student seminar class, all conducted in English. In 2016, the first intake of freshman students, there was no EL element to the English listening class, although the textbook used had self-study units, 8 of which were set as homework during the course with credit given for completion. It was clear that even for those students successfully completing all of them, that an EL element had the potential to increase the amount of listening practice that they were getting in English. Students were encouraged to do self-directed listening, in a context, however, where it was clear balancing academic work outside of class time with part-time jobs and long commutes was an issue for students. There seemed to be a strong chance that this would be seen as a low priority that a structured EL program that contributed to class credit would address. In addition, the reading class already used ER successfully in this academic year, with research showing students had a more positive attitude towards reading than before, including many of those students who said they had disliked reading in high school. So in 2017, I implemented a self-study listening program combining the self-study materials from the class textbook with a narrow listening scheme based on Mayora's 2017 article about his intervention in a Columbian University context. This used student-selected online news reports with credit given for the number of news reports listened to. This was used again in 2018 with some modifications to the credit award. So in 2016, we had a maximum of the 8 self-study units in the textbook, but in 2017, the minimum requirement was 21 tasks, those same 8 textbook units, plus 13 news reports. But that was a minimum, there was no maximum. Only 1 of 74 students completed fewer than 8 tasks, the maximum from 2016, and 64 out of 74 completed at least the minimum number of 21 tasks. 12 students completed more than 40 tasks. So this tended to support my hypothesis that an EL program was a way to increase the amount of listening input that students were getting outside of class. Now, the disadvantage of doing this presentation online is that I cannot provide you with a handout with the form students filled after completing each listening task as I did at last year's conference. In short, students were asked to make brief notes about the contents of the news report, mainly focused on overall meaning. A further section then asked them to rate each report's difficulty, their own degree of understanding, how many times they watched or listened to the news report, and finally a yes/no question about whether they would recommend the report to classmates. And here are some of the examples of findings in 2017 in response to the question, do you recommend this report to your classmates? 52.15% of students recommended reports which were very difficult to understand, compared to over 91% who recommended the reports that were quite easy or very easy to understand. Where students' understanding of the report was poor, that was recommended in only just over 35% of cases, contrasted with reports where the understanding was excellent, which was recommended in 94.9% of those cases. And then 88.17% of the reports that could be completed by watching or listening once were recommended, compared to only 71.86% of reports that needed to be watched or listened to 5 or more times. So, this gave some empirical support to the contention that choosing material that was too difficult was a major issue for learners in trying EL. However, this was largely exploratory for my own curiosity. I had not conducted any tests of statistical significance, so it encouraged me to try to do something more rigorous in this 2018 study. I researched these 2 questions. Can we replicate the findings about the relationship of difficulty or comprehension to the likelihood students will recommend the report to classmates? The short answer to this was yes. Students answered that they would recommend 90% of the video or audio reports they chose. Among that small proportion of news reports that were not recommended, students were less likely to recommend reports that needed to be watched or listened to a greater number of times to complete the task. They were also less likely to recommend reports that they found difficult or where their understanding was poor. And my second question was, can statistical significance be demonstrated to show that students were more likely to recommend news reports that they perceived as easier, they understood well, and needed to watch fewer times? And yes, again, for each of the factors, number of times watched, difficulty, and students' understanding, the differences were significant at p less than 0.001. So, in the present research conducted with the 2019 listening classes to replicate the finding of statistical significance from the previous research. There were 60 students in 4 intact classes based on their April 2019 overall TOEIC score. All did the EL as required homework, and after the return of consent forms, I had 60 students completing 1,237 EL tasks included in the database for the study. The participants' TOEIC scores ranged from 210 to 780, with an average of 434, and specifically on the listening section they averaged 255, with a range of 85 to 430. Self-study homework was done after lessons 2 to 22 of the 23 lessons. So, a minimum 1 self-study task per homework, 13 of which are EL, the other 8 of which come from the textbook. The self-study is 20% of the class grade, 5% for the 8 textbook tasks, 15% for the EL. In the EL, 13 tasks would mean 9 out of 15, a C grade. Higher grades were awarded based on a greater number of tasks on a curve at the end of the course. There was no specified number of tasks to achieve an A+. This was an attempt to avoid a ceiling effect where students aimed at a specific maximum and would go no further. That students who were motivated to listen a lot would listen as much as they possibly could. So the assessment was 15% for EL based solely on the number of tasks completed. There is no extra credit for length, difficulty, or correct comprehension. And the results of this, on average, the 60 students in the sample completed 20.9 news report tasks each. 9 out of the 60 students completed fewer than the minimum 13 tasks, and 9 out of 60 completed at least 30 news report tasks. Students recommended 88% of the video or audio reports they chose, quite similar to the 90% recommendation from the previous study. Here we see the news reports chosen, broken down by website. There's a total of 1,237 reports chosen. The blue here represents reports chosen from the Breaking News English website. The red from News and Levels. This green section, reports chosen from the BBC. The orange section is VOA News Learning English's website, and the yellow coloured section here is CNN. We see that these 5 websites make up a large proportion of the news reports chosen, but we can also see that there's a reasonable chunk of other news websites here as well. And we see here that slightly over half of the reports were graded in some way. For example, the vocabulary was made easier for students who were not listening to English as their first language, or a transcript was provided. It was in some way aimed at non-native speakers of English. This other part of reports were reports such as from BBC or CNN that were regular, sometimes called authentic news reports, aimed predominantly at first language English speakers. Here we see the number of news reports divided by the number of times they were watched. So, for example, this top bar is reports that were watched 5 or more times, and we can see that there are nearly 500 of these. Reports that were watched 4 times, there are slightly over 300 of these. We can see that reports that were watched 5 or more times were the most numerous, and it gets less numerous down to the few reports that could be done with just 1 time being watched or listened to. We see that those reports that were watched 5 or more times were only recommended to other students in about 80% of cases. Remember that the average recommendation rate among the whole sample was 88%. So this is considerably below the average, whereas those reports that were watched 4 or fewer times to complete the task are all recommended at rates above the average recommendation rate for the whole sample. Again, we see the same pattern. There's a very low recommendation rate for very difficult news reports, and that everything ranging from very easy to a little difficult is recommended at above the average recommendation rate, with the highest recommendation rates for those ranging from very easy to neither easy nor difficult. This is the students rating their own understanding of the news reports. More than 500 of these, the students rated their own understanding as good. Most reports were rated as okay, good, or very good for the student's own understanding. Those where the student's understanding was considered excellent or poor were relatively few in number. But again, we see this large drop-off where the ones where they have an okay understanding are only recommended 84% of the time, and then that drops right down to 58.7% for those where the understanding is poor. So returning to our research question, can the findings that students most often recommend the reports they found easiest, where they rated their own comprehension highly and where they needed to watch or listen fewer times, be confirmed when repeating the study? Yes, for each of the factors, number of times watched, difficulty, and students' understanding, the differences were significant at p less than 0.001 when comparing the means of the recommended and non-recommended reports using an independent samples t-test. Here are the references for today's presentation, and I'll be around for 5 minutes to take any questions you have. Thank you.